Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is the screencast for the lecture number 3, Acute Inflammation. So the intended learning outcome of this lecture is to students will be able to define inflammation, so by the end of this session the students will be able to define inflammation and list the types of inflammation, and they can able to explain the vascular changes in acute inflammation and explain the clinical outcomes by involving the various chemical mediators released during the process of acute inflammation, and they can able to analyze the interaction of various drugs such as NSAID, steroids during the process of acute inflammation. Before going into the lecture slides, I would like to discuss certain basics. And you all know a blood vessel is lined by the endothelial cells when and this endothelial cell sits on the basement membrane. This endothelial cell sits on the basement membrane, and this is the blood vessel. This is the blood vessel, and this endothelial cell sits on the, this is the basement membrane. The endothelial cell sits on the basement membrane. This is the basement membrane. So this is the arteriolar side. Then they become capillaries. When they become capillaries, they have some gap between the endothelial cells. They have some gap between the endothelial cells. So you can see a gap in between the endothelial cells. So this is endothelial gap, which is seen in the capillaries. Okay, then it becomes vein, venules, and it continues. Okay, so the blood inside the blood vessel contains cells, and that cells which goes flow in the center. The cells travel in the center of the blood, and outer is by the fluid. The fluid. So this kind of flow is normal, and this flow is called, this kind of flow is called laminar flow. Okay, this kind of flow is called laminar flow. So if you take a blood, the blood has two components, cells and the fluid. Fluid is called plasma. The fluid is called plasma. The fluid is called plasma. Plasma contains water, proteins, and electrolytes. Cells are all of three types: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. This is venular side. So now if you see the WBCs are of 5 types: neutrophil, eosinophils, basophils. So if you see the neutrophils, the nucleus is lobed and they have granules. Eosinophils also lobed nucleus, but it is bilobed, and even basophil is bilobed. And this also has, eosinophils has granules, basophils has granules. So because of these granules, they are called granulocytes. Granulocytes. And they have lobular architecture of nucleus, so it looks like a multiple nucleus, so they called morpho means looking, polymorpho nuclear. Leukocytes means WBC. Polymorphonuclear leukocytes. And if you see other two types of cells, they are called lymphocytes and monocytes. Lymphocytes has single nucleus. On light microscopy there is no granules. Granules are not seen normally. And monocytes are little bit bigger cells and they have kidney shaped nucleus. They have bean shaped nucleus, but they looks like a single nucleus. So they don't have granules, so they are called agranulocytes. They are called agranulocytes, and they have single nucleus looking, and they are called mononuclear leukocytes. They are called mononuclear leukocytes. So what we are discussing about the blood vessels and the blood. So the blood vessels are lined by a endothelial cells. Blood vessels are lined by endothelial cells. The blood vessels are lined by, these cells are called endothelial cells. These blood vessels are called endothelial cells. Okay, and if you see the wall of the endothelial cells. The endothelial cell sits on the basement membrane. After the basement membrane, we have smooth muscle cells. 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 Okay. So what happens here is these smooth muscle cells are in the wall. Okay, so the blood flow is laminar blood flow, that is normal blood flow, where the cells travel in the center. The cells travels in the center. Okay, so red blood cells and WBCs and small granular cells, platelets, they also travel in the center and surrounded by the fluid, that is plasma. Okay, so and you all know the blood has cells and plasma, cells and plasma, cells as RBCs, WBCs, platelets. Plasma contains water, proteins, electrolytes, and WBCs, there are 5 types of WBCs: neutrophil, eosinophil, basophil. They have granules in the cytoplasm and they are called granulocytes, and they have lobular nucleus, so they are called polymorphonuclear leukocytes. And WBCs, other 2 WBCs are lymphocytes and monocytes, and they look like a single nucleus and they don't have granules. They are called agranulocytes and mononuclear leukocytes. Okay, now in the previous chapter we discussed if the cell don't get oxygen, hypoxia, the cell, what happens, they go for cell death. The cells goes for cell death, that is necrosis. So I told in the chapter necrosis induce inflammation, right? So why there is inflammation, that necrotic area has to be removed, then the healing will start. So to remove this area, we need inflammation. So inflammation is a protective mechanism. It's not a disease. But remember, inflammation will comes with a price, that is it creates tissue injury. So this necrotic areas can induce inflammation, that can be because so that area can be removed from the body, and that can, then after that it starts the healing. Or the bacteria which enters the tissue, which enters the body, that can induce inflammation, because bacteria has to be removed from the body. For example, when the bacteria or when the tissue goes for necrosis, there are some connective tissue cells called mast cells. What are these cells? Called mast cells. Mast cells releases histamine. This histamine immediately goes and acts on the blood vessels which are near to the injured area or near to the infection. So there are some blood vessels which are near to the infection, and the histamine go and act on those blood vessels. Once the histamine goes and act on those blood vessels, actually this histamine acts on the smooth muscle cells. The histamine acts on the smooth muscle cells, so which is in the wall of the blood vessels. So once it acts on the smooth muscle cells, then immediately this blood vessel goes for vasodilation. This blood vessels goes for vasodilations. The area which they are acting, immediately that area goes for vasodilation. What happens, and you all know this blood vessels are lined by the endothelial cells, but there is some gap between the endothelial cells in the capillaries. So So these blood vessels are lined by endothelial cells, but there is some gap in between the capillaries, the endothelial cells in the capillaries. So when there is histamine causes vasodilation, then immediately, so what is this? Vasodilation. So which causes more blood to enter into the vasodilated area because of more space in the blood vessels. So more blood enters. When more blood enters, okay, so when more blood enters, two things happens. One is it increases the pressure. It increases the pressure, and pressure increases, then the fluid goes out. When the pressure increases, the fluid goes out. That is called increased vascular permeability. That is called increased vascular permeability. Increased vascular permeability. So once the blood vessel is dilated, that causes more blood flow, then that causes increased pressure, that increases the fluid to escape out. Now we got fluid. When the fluid is going, the fluid also contains proteins. The fluid also contains protein. The fluid also contains protein. The fluid also contains proteins. So this all happens because of what? The bacteria or necrotic tissue which has to be removed by the inflammation. So the mast cell secrete histamine. Then the histamine acts on the smooth muscle cell. So it acts on the smooth muscle cell. Then there is vasodilation. Vasodilation causes increased blood flow. That causes increase in pressure, that causes increased vascular permeability, and the fluid escapes out. That fluid contains protein. When that fluid is escaping out, when the more blood comes, the laminar flow is altered. Second step is laminar flow is altered. Changed. Laminar flow is altered or changed. So then the bloods, then until this is called vascular changes. This vascular changes happens mainly because of histamine. For example, somebody is having nasal infection. So what happens immediately? The mast cells secrete histamine. So the histamine goes and act on the nasal mucosal blood vessels. So the blood vessels dilate, and the fluid increase, vasodilation happens, and more fluid comes, and that is the reason of uh, running nose. That's why in the running nose they give antihistamine. To block this histamine, to block the histamine action, so that the histamine action is stopped, vasodilation is stopped, then there is no pressure, there is no vascular permeability, then automatically the running nose gets stopped. So because the fluid cannot escape out from the capillaries. Okay, so now I hope you all understood the vascular changes happening in the inflammation. So vascular changes is the first change which happens in the inflammation, which is immediate, fast, rapid. So this is very fast and very rapid. So it is called acute inflammation. Okay, so next step is So after vasodilation, this is the endothelial cells, and there is a gap between the endothelial cells in the capillaries. This vasodilation happens because of what? Because of histamine acting on the smooth muscle cells. Histamine acting on the smooth muscle cells. So we have smooth muscle cells, right? The histamine acts on the, especially on the arteriolar side, especially on the arteriolar side. Okay, so we have smooth muscle cells and mast cells secreted. This is mast cell secreted histamine. This histamine is act on the smooth muscle cells. Then it resulted in vasodilation. This vasodilation caused more blood coming, increased the volume. This increased volume always causes increase in pressure. Then automatically this causes increased vascular permeability and the fluid, more fluid enters. Okay, and the fluid escapes out. So the fluid goes out along with protein. Now until this vascular changes. Because of this there is alteration in the alteration, that is change in the laminar. Now you all know what is laminar flow, right? So there is change in the laminar flow, which means the cells comes to the periphery. Once the cells comes to the periphery, if it touches the endothelium, the endothelial cells sends them out. The endothelial cells sends them out. So the cell which goes out is neutrophil. The cell which goes out is neutrophil if it is acute inflammation. So for example, here there is bacteria, then the neutrophil goes and phagocytoses the bacteria. And you all know they have lysosomes, and this will fuse and they will kill the bacteria. So they will kill the bacteria. They have lysosomes and these phagosomes, they will kill the bacteria and they also die. So we have new neutrophil coming, and there are some bacteria growing, and some neutrophil are taking the bacteria and they are also dying. So this area is full of this. First of all, this change is called cellular event. This is called cellular event. So this is called vascular event. This is called vascular events. Understand? So because of this fluid, protein and neutrophil killing the bacteria, and they also die during that process, and new neutrophils, living neutrophils, and sometimes you can see the living bacteria. This all together called pus. If it is largely collected in one area, it is called abscess. So in acute inflammation, the outcome is pus. That is, if it is collected in large amount in one area, it is called abscess, and this is also called exudate. So this is the things happen in acute inflammation. Okay, so now let us discuss one more mechanism. Now for example, this is the bacteria. Now I said the neutrophil comes, right? That is the cellular event. This is the neutrophil. Okay, and I'm going to uh, explain during acute inflammation. During acute inflammation, there are other proteins increased in the blood, that is called tumor necrosis factor and interleukin 1. Okay, it is otherwise called TNF. So interleukin 1. So what this does is, this is comes in acute inflammation, and this proteins will stimulate the neutrophil. Okay, so now I'm drawing the neutrophil in bigger size. This will stimulate the neutrophil, that is, this will stimulate the neutrophil, and this is the neutrophil cell membrane. What is this? This is neutrophil cell membrane, and this neutrophil cell membrane contains lot of phospholipids. They contains lot of phospholipids, and this is the nucleus of the neutrophil. They have lobed nucleus. They have lobed nucleus. Understand? And what this TNF and interleukin 1 does is, they increase the enzyme called phospholipase A2. This enzyme is increased in the neutrophil during acute inflammation because of TNF and IL-1. So this phospholipase, this is what? Phospholipid. This phospholipid is broken down by this phospholipase, and they form arachidonic acid. So this arachidonic acid is broken down by another enzyme called cyclooxygenase enzyme. So this enzyme will break the arachidonic acid, and they form another substance called prostaglandins. This prostaglandin escape from the go out of the neutrophil, go to the blood, and then they reach the brain. In the brain they go to hypothalamus, and they make the hypothalamus to increase the body temperature. They increase the body temperature. Understand? So this results in fever as well as pain. Okay, so that's why during inflammation we have fever and pain. So when we want to stop the fever and pain, or reduce the fever and pain, so we used to give some drugs. So one of the drug is steroids. So steroids block this phospholipase. Steroids block the phospholipase. They block the phospholipase, and the whole process is stopped. Or we give aspirin or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs called like indomethacin, ibuprofen, okay. This will block the cyclooxygenase. This will block the cyclooxygenase, and the prostaglandin is reduced, and fever is reduced, pain is reduced. So this is the important mechanism you should know. So during acute inflammation, TNF and interleukin 1 is increased. That will stimulate the neutrophil, and that will increase the phospholipase A2, that will break the phospholipid. Then arachidonic acid is formed. Then cyclooxygenase enzyme break the arachidonic acid, and prostaglandin is formed. Then they go to the blood, then they go to the brain. They go to the blood and they go to the brain, and they reach the hypothalamus, and they will increase the body temperature, results in fever and pain. So when if you want to reduce the fever and pain, you can give the steroids which blocks the phospholipase A2, or you can give the aspirin or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like indomethacin and ibuprofen that can block the cyclooxygenase, and that can reduce the prostaglandin. Automatically the pain and fever is reduced. Okay, so now I am going to discuss one more concept here. You should know stomach produce acid. So the acid can damage the stomach wall. So stomach wall is protected by mucus. Stomach wall is protected by mucus, and this mucus is produced because of cyclooxygenase enzyme. Cyclooxygenase enzyme help them to produce mucus. If we block cyclooxygenase here, and cyclooxygenase here also get blocked, so mucus will be reduced. That results in acid will damage the stomach wall. Acid will damage the stomach wall, results in gastritis or ulcer. So when you give aspirin or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, so we get a side effect of gastritis and ulcer. To avoid that, we give a drug along with aspirin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs is anti-acid drugs. So this anti-acid drugs will reduce the acid, and if mucus is reduced also, then it is in balance, so it will not produce the complication. So this is the mechanism involved in acute inflammation, and so acute inflammation produces fever and pain, and which can be modulated, which can be changed by using certain drugs, which can block the certain enzymes, like cyclooxygenase is blocked by aspirin, and steroids blocks the phospholipase A2. Okay, so now with this basics we will go to the slides. So inflammation all produce characteristically 5 signs. So when you have inflammation, that area will become red, that area will become painful or tender, and that area will swell. After that there will be warmness in that area. Because of this reason, that area function is lost, that leads to loss of function. So inflammation is a protective response which helps to remove the cell injury causes necrotic cells and tissues which has to be removed. So for that we need inflammation. So inflammation is there from the birth. It is called innate immunity. So inflammation can be acute or chronic and depends upon the duration and the cells involved. So acute inflammation is rapid and it is short duration, and it may last from few minutes to few days, but it is characteristic by the neutrophilic leukocyte accumulation, mainly neutrophils, and there will be a plasma protein exudation. So whereas chronic inflammation is insidious onset, there for longer duration, but characterized by the lymphocytes and macrophage, and it always ends up with fibrosis, that we will discuss in the next chapter. So first step in acute inflammation is vascular change. There is a increased blood flow because of vasodilation, and structural changes permit more plasma proteins to leave the circulation, that is called increased vascular permeability. So cellular events is followed by the vascular event, where the leukocyte escapes out and accumulate in the area of injury. The principal leukocyte involved in acute inflammation are neutrophil, and other name for neutrophil is polymorphonuclear leukocytes. So this is the vascular changes picture, and this is the thing happens. The cell once attached the endothelium, it comes out and it phagocytosis and kill the mycobacterium, and they also die. So in acute inflammation, the vascular change, neutrophil coming out, and the mediators involved are histamine, TNF, IL-1 and prostaglandins. You should know at least these 4, and this ends up with abscess formation. It ends up with pus formation. So this is the definition for pus. So neutrophilic cellular debris may or may not contain infected organism, and degenerated neutrophil is called pus. So how this whole event happens? Because of this histamine, and this is released mainly from the mast cells. Same type of chemical substance is called serotonin, which is released in the platelet, and it causes arteriolar dilation, and which leads to the increased vascular permeability. Okay, now arachidonic acid metablates, you all know this arachidonic acid metablates comes from the cell membrane phospholipids by the action of phospholipase A2, and they produce arachidonic acid. So from there they produce arachidonic acid. This arachidonic acid is produced, and then a cyclooxygenase enzyme breaks the arachidonic acid and they produce prostaglandins. So cell membrane phospholipid is broken down by the phospholipase and they form arachidonic acid. Then cyclooxygenase break the arachidonic acid and they form prostaglandin. So the prostaglandin is responsible for pain and fever. Prostaglandin is responsible for pain and fever. So we use steroid to block the phospholipase A2, so the whole mechanism is shut down. So steroid is a very powerful anti-inflammatory drug. So that's why we don't use, because we need inflammation, because we need the bacteria to be removed, we need the necrotic areas to be removed. So we only don't want pain and fever. So if you use the cyclooxygenase inhibitor like aspirin and indomethacin, they can block the cyclooxygenase and they can reduce the pain and fever. Okay, so prostaglandin is all involved in the pathogenesis of pain and fever in inflammation. So aspirin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as ibuprofen inhibit the cyclooxygenase activity, and prostaglandin synthesis, PG means prostaglandin synthesis, is inhibited, so the pain and fever is reduced. So there are two forms of cyclooxygenase 1 and 2. So cyclooxygenase 1 is expressed in the gastric mucosa, as I explained, that will produce mucus. So cyclooxygenase is needed for mucus protection. So if you block the cyclooxygenase, it will end up with gastric ulceration. Remember, glucocorticoids, otherwise called as steroids, it is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent because it blocks the phospholipase A2. So cytokines, the chemical substances, cytokines means cell released chemical substance. Cyto means cell, kines means proteins. Cell released protein TNF and IL-1 is involved in acute inflammation, whereas interferon gamma and IL-12 involved in chronic inflammation. This ends the chapter 3, acute inflammation.